Welcome to the Deep Dive. It is Monday, February 23, 2026. And I have to be honest with you right off the bat here, just looking at the stack of papers, the printed out reports, the blog posts, and all of the data streams we've got piled up on the desk today. The air in the studio feels pretty heavy.
It does. It feels incredibly heavy. Usually when we sit down to do these deep dives, we are looking at a long-term trend or maybe a new piece of consumer technology or doing a historical retrospective. But today we are looking at a moment in time right now, this very week in February 2026, where the geopolitical tectonic plates aren't just shifting, they are grinding against each other. And it is loud enough for everyone to hear it.
Yeah, it feels less like a post-mortem analysis and more like we are reading the seismograph right before the earthquake actually hits. We're diving into a collection of insights today, and they're primarily centered around a piece by Paramendra Kumar Bhagat. He writes under the moniker Barack Face, and the piece is titled The Brittleness of Tyranny. But it is not just that one article we're looking at. We are pulling in video reports from Sky News Australia, breaking updates from HD India, spiritual commentary from Rabbi David Pinto, and just a whole host of real-time data from this exact week.
And the picture that emerges from all these disparate sources is terrifying, frankly, but it is also really fascinating from a structural perspective, because we are looking specifically at Iran, but we aren't just looking at the day-to-day politics of Iran. We are looking at a phenomenon, a paradox, really, of how power works.
Right, and that paradox is exactly the hook for me. This is what made me want to clear the schedule and do this deep dive with you today. The central idea here is that inflexibility in a regime, that tough guy, iron fist posture, the tank parades, the secret police on every corner, that inflexibility is almost always mistaken for strength. We look at a dictator and we naturally think, wow, he has total control. He is completely untouchable. But the source material today argues the exact opposite. It argues that absolute control actually creates brittleness.
Brittleness, yeah, that is the absolutely crucial word for the rest of our conversation. Brittleness.
And the stakes for understanding this, well, they really couldn't be higher for you listening right now, because we aren't just sitting in an ivory tower talking about abstract political theory. We are talking about a 10-day deadline issued by President Trump. We are talking about nuclear thresholds being crossed potentially within a single week. We are talking about a regime that might be about to completely collapse, and the incredibly dangerous vacuum of what that looks like when it happens.
It is the difference between a tree that bends in a hurricane and a giant glass pillar that stands perfectly rigid, perfectly still, right up until the exact moment it shatters into a million pieces. Today, we are analyzing the glass pillar that is the Islamic Republic of Iran.
So let us unpack this properly. I want to start with section 1 of our outline here, which we are calling the theory of the glass giant. Because before we get to the nuclear centrifuges and the riots in the streets, we really need to understand the basic mechanism of why these specific types of regimes break down. The source material references a political scientist named Marcel Dirsis and his book, How Tyrants Fall.
Right. And Dirsis is just essential reading for this context because the conventional wisdom, the stuff you hear on the Sunday morning cable news shows all the time, is that you need a strong man to keep a country stable, especially in a volatile region like the Middle East. The narrative is that you need the iron fist to keep the factions from tearing each other apart. But Dirsis completely turns that on its head. He argues that dictators are actually terrified. They're the most paranoid people on earth. They are constantly looking over their shoulder.
I want to stick a pin in that phrase you used earlier, though, the glass giant. Because when I look at footage of these regimes, whether it is North Korea or Iran or Russia, they do not look like glass to me at all. They look like reinforced concrete. They have the literal tanks. They have the riot police, the surveillance state apparatus. If I am a regular citizen living there, the regime feels unbreakable. So is this whole glass giant concept just sort of wishful thinking by Western analysts?
No, it is not wishful thinking, but it is exactly the illusion that the dictator spends billions and billions of dollars to maintain. It is a facade. Dirsis argues that looking at the tanks and the military parades is looking at the wrong metric entirely. You have to look at the information flow, the internal communication of the state.
Information flow. Okay. What do you mean by that exactly?
Think about it this way. Imagine you are a mid-level manager in a totalitarian tyranny. Let us say you run a factory, or you're the governor of a small province. You have some bad news. Production at your factory is way down, or the local people are getting angry about food shortages, or the municipal water has run out. Do you tell your boss the truth?
Probably not. Not if I want to keep my job or, these kinds of regimes. If I want to keep my head attached to my shoulders, I'm going to hide the bad news.
Exactly. You lie. It is basic self-preservation. You report that production is actually up 10%. Then your boss takes your report, and because he is also scared of his boss, he tweaks the numbers and reports that production is up 20%. By the time the official report hits the dictator's desk in the capital, the economy is booming, there are record surpluses, and the people are weeping with joy because they love him so much.
So the dictator is just flying totally blind.
Worse than flying blind. He is flying a plane where all the instruments on the dashboard are just painted on. He fully believes he has control. He thinks he knows exactly what altitude he is at, but the steering wheel isn't actually connected to the flaps anymore. That is the glass aspect of the Giant. The structure looks completely solid from the outside, but inside the connective tissue, which is the truth, the accurate data required to govern, has just completely rotted away.
And I guess that works perfectly fine right up until the moment it doesn't.
Right up until a rock hits the glass. Yes.
I really love that distinction the author makes between strength and rigidity. Because strength is actually the ability to absorb a blow, right? If you're driving your car, you want shock absorbers that compress and bounce back. You don't want rigid metal bars instead of springs.
Exactly. That is a perfect analogy. Strength is adaptation. It is the ability to look at a situation and say, okay, the people are really unhappy about this new tax policy, so let's debate it. Let's change the tax so they don't burn down the presidential palace. Rigidity is the absolute refusal to change course. And when you refuse to change in a world that is shifting constantly, economically, technologically, socially, you create a massive pressure cooker. The source material points out something critical here, which is the internal fracture theory.
Break that down for us. What is the internal fracture theory?
It is the historical observation that most tyrants do not fall because of a massive foreign invasion. They don't fall because a coalition army marches across their borders and storms the capital. They fall because of internal rot. They fall because the people closest to them, the inner circle or the domestic structures holding them up, suddenly snap under the pressure. The military decides not to shoot the protesters. The bodyguards decide to walk away.
And the source brings up a historical case study that I think is just incredibly haunting. It is the story of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania back in 1989. Now, I know the broad strokes of the Cold War ending, but walk us through why this specific moment with Ceausescu is the perfect textbook example of this brittleness we are talking about.
It really is the ultimate example. You have to set the scene to fully grasp it. It is December of 1989. Ceausescu has been the absolute, unquestioned dictator of Romania for almost a quarter of a century. He has this massive, terrifying secret police force called the Curated. They have informers everywhere. He lives in this completely insulated bubble where his sycophants constantly tell him he is the genius of the Carpathians, the most beloved leader in human history.
So he had completely bought into his own cult of personality. He genuinely believed his own hype.
He absolutely did. So there is some civil unrest bubbling up in a western city called Timișoara. It's getting a little chaotic. Ceausescu decides to do what he always does when there's a problem. He decides to give a grand speech from the balcony of the Central Committee building in the capital, Bucharest. He has his people bus and a massive crowd of factory workers, tens of thousands of people. He expects the usual highly choreographed routine, the forced applause, the cheering on cue, the waving of the state flags.
Right. It's supposed to be a massive show of force, a broadcast to the whole country saying, look how much everyone loves me, everything is fine.
Precisely. So he steps out onto the balcony in his winter coat. He starts speaking. And for the first couple of minutes, it is totally normal. The crowd is silent, listening. But then something happens that changes the course of history in an instant.
The moment the glass cracks.
Exactly. Somewhere deep in the back of this massive crowd, somebody boos. Just one person or a small group. Then somebody else whistles derisively. Then you start hearing shouting. And because this entire event is being broadcast live on national state television, the camera is zoomed in right on Ceausescu's face.
I have actually seen that archival clip. It is chilling to watch.
It really is. Because it wasn't anger on his face. It wasn't rage. It was genuine, unadulterated shock. He actually stops speaking mid-sentence. He raises his right hand and sort of waves it, almost like he is trying to swat a fly away. He looks over at his wife, Elena, who is standing next to him. He practically mouths the words, "What is happening?" In that one tiny split second, the complete hollowness of his absolute authority was exposed to 20 million Romanians live on air. The entire country saw him not as a terrifying god king, but as a confused, weak old man being yelled at by his own citizens.
The spell just broke, right there on live television.
The spell broke instantly. The crowd standing in that square realized, wait a minute, if I am booing and the guy next to me is booing and the guy over there is whistling, he can't possibly kill all of us. There are too many of us. The fear just evaporated.
And the speed of the regime's collapse from that exact balcony moment is just staggering when you think about it.
It was 4 days. Literally 4 days. He went from having absolute, unquestioned, godlike power on that balcony, controlling every aspect of Romanian life, to him and his wife being tied up after a drumhead trial and executed by a firing squad against a red wall at a military base. That is exactly what we mean when we talk about brittleness. The system looks impenetrable until the very second it isn't. And when it finally goes, it goes incredibly fast. There is no slow decline. It just shatters.
The source material also mentions a much fresher wound for the world to consider: Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The next notes his fall in late 2024.
Yes, and speaking from the perspective of where we are sitting right now in February 2026, that is very recent history. It is a very fresh memory for the geopolitical community. Assad managed to hold on for years and years through a brutally destructive civil war. He basically leveled his own country, invited in foreign militaries, and destroyed millions of lives just to stay in the presidential palace. But eventually, the prolonged erosion of his state's foundation was just too much. It finally gave way. And it serves to remind you, the listener, that these aren't just ancient history lessons from the Cold War. This is the exact rhythm of the era we are living in right now.
Yeah, but speaking of ancient history, the blog post by Paramendra Kumar Bhagat actually throws in some really interesting historical deep cuts, too. He mentions someone named Childeric II.
Childeric II, yeah. He really goes way back into the archives for that one. Childeric II was a medieval king of Francia, way back in the 7th century. And the reason Bhagat brings him up is that Childeric was assassinated specifically because he completely disregarded the established legal norms of his own society. He got angry and tied a high-ranking nobleman to a stake and had him brutally beaten, which was totally illegal even for a king to do to a noble back then. The nobleman survived, harbored a massive grudge, came back later and assassinated him.
So the lesson there really is universal across time periods. Doesn't matter what century you're in.
It is entirely universal. Whether you are looking at Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines or Francisco Macias Nguema in Equatorial Guinea or a medieval Frankish king, the structural pattern is always identical. The ruler refuses to adapt to reality. They start relying on a smaller and smaller echo chamber of sycophantic loyalists. They break the foundational norms of their own society, and eventually the floor just drops out from underneath them completely.
So that is the theory established, the glass giant. The concept that supreme rigidity guarantees a catastrophic shatter. Now, I want to pivot us. Let us look at the reality on the ground based on the data in front of us. We are looking at a snapshot of Iran right now this exact week, February 2026. And I really have to say, just reviewing these numbers before we hit record, stomach churning doesn't even begin to cover it. It is incredibly dark.
No, stomach churning is putting it mildly. The situation on the streets is horrific.
The source outlines a very specific timeline leading up to this week. Apparently, nationwide protests started bubbling up again in late 2025, sort of gaining momentum, and then really peaking just last month in January 2026.
Yeah.
But then we have this specific massive event detailed here, the massacre of January 8th and 9th, 2026.
We really need to pause on that for a second. We cannot just breeze past those dates.
I agree, because I want to look closely at the timeline here. The numbers in this report. Honestly, I had to stop and reread the paragraph 3 times to make sure my eyes weren't skipping a decimal point or that it wasn't a typo. The report cites a highly specific 38-hour window, January 8th and January 9th. They are calling it the Bloody Weekend.
Yes, the Bloody Weekend.
The source claims a confirmed death toll of 30,000 people. 30,000 in 2 days.
It literally creates a heavy silence in the room, just saying that number out loud. 30,000 human beings.
I mean, help me try to visualize that scale of carnage. That isn't a riot control operation gone wrong. That isn't local police using tear gas and rubber bullets and things getting out of hand. 30,000 people is a sold-out professional sports arena, plus everyone standing in the parking lot outside, dead, in 48 hours.
Yeah.
From a purely logistical standpoint, how is that even physically possible for a state to execute?
It implies industrial-scale violence, state-directed, highly coordinated mass murder. To hit a kill count like that in under 2 days, you aren't sending cops out with batons to arrest instigators. You are using heavy machine guns mounted on the back of pickup trucks firing indiscriminately into dense crowds of civilians. You are placing military snipers on every single rooftop with orders to shoot to kill. You are likely using heavy artillery on neighborhoods or conducting aerial strafing runs. It means the entire logistical chain of the state's military apparatus was entirely focused on the mass liquidation of its own citizens.
Liquidation, that is such a heavy, dark word to use.
But tragically, it is the only word in the English language that actually fits the data. If you are the ruling regime and you make the deliberate decision to pull the trigger 30,000 times on your own people, you have crossed a historical Rubicon. You aren't trying to restore civic order anymore. You are sending a very clear, very final message that says, we will kill every single one of you if that is what it takes for us to physically remain in power. It is a desperate, totally frantic bid to maintain control.
And if we map that back onto our core theory of brittleness, a genuinely strong, confident government never needs to kill 30,000 of its own citizens in 48 hours.
Never. A strong government has inherent legitimacy. People generally follow the laws and pay their taxes because they believe in the social contract of the state, or at the very least, they grudgingly accept it as a reality. When you have to slaughter a small city's worth of people in a weekend, you are broadcasting to the entire world that you have lost 0.0% of your political legitimacy. You are ruling purely and exclusively by the barrel of a gun.
And what about the reaction from the Iranian public? You would naturally think that that level of unspeakable violence, the sheer terror of seeing 30,000 dead, would completely silence the population. You'd assume everyone would just lock their doors, pull the blinds, and hide under the bed out of pure self-preservation. But the source material describes this ongoing cycle of mourning that completely defies that logic.
This is exactly where the regime fundamentally miscalculates the cultural DNA of its own people. This cycle is deeply, intrinsically embedded in Iranian culture and specifically in Shia Islam. There is a traditional 40-day mourning cycle for the dead, which is known in these contexts as arbanin. So let us trace the timeline. The security forces massacre protesters on January 8th.
Right, January 8th.
Then, exactly 40 days later, the families, the neighbors, the entire community are culturally and religiously obligated to gather together to mourn those deceased individuals. But naturally, that religious gathering immediately transforms into a political protest because they are mourning people who were just murdered by the state.
So the security forces show up and attack the mourning gathering, too.
Exactly. They attack the mourners, which creates a whole new wave of casualties, new martyrs, which then mathematically necessitates another massive mourning ceremony exactly 40 days after that. It becomes a perpetual motion machine of civic resistance that the government cannot easily shut down.
And the source notes some specific dates relating to this. February 17th and February 19th, 2026, which is literally just a few days ago from where we are sitting right now. The reports say that despite the absolute threat of death, despite fully knowing that 30,000 people were just killed, thousands upon thousands of citizens still came out onto the streets.
That is a level of personal courage that I honestly can barely comprehend sitting here in a safe studio. It is astounding.
It really is humbling to even read about.
But strategically, it signifies something massive. It signifies that the fear barrier has been permanently broken. That is a specific term that revolution scholars and sociologists use. The fear barrier. The regime is desperately trying to reinstall that baseline level of fear using massacres, but it is just not working the way it used to in the past. The religious memorials have turned into, as the author specifically puts it, flashpoints of resistance.
Now, structurally speaking, how is the government itself reacting to this? If the populace is increasingly fearless, what is the internal machinery of the state doing? The source text mentions a very specific shift happening right now toward an IRGC republic. What exactly does that mean for the listener who might not be deep into Iranian internal politics?
So, historically, Iran since 1979 has been a theocracy. It has been ruled by the Shia clerics, with the supreme leader sitting at the absolute top of the pyramid. But over the last decade, as the religious legitimacy of the state has completely faded and as the young population becomes increasingly secular and vehemently anti-regime, the traditional clerics in their religious robes simply cannot hold the street anymore. They do not command any natural respect or authority.
So if the clerics can't enforce the rules, who steps into that power vacuum?
The guys who have all the guns. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. What we are witnessing right now in real time is essentially a quiet, rolling military coup taking place entirely within the regime itself. It is rapidly transitioning from a religious theocracy into a hardline military dictatorship that just wears religious clothing for show.
The source material actually describes the entire country as currently being structured for siege.
Right. It is literally being managed like a medieval fortress under attack. The IRGC generals are systematically taking over the domestic economy, the civilian administration, the border crossings, the telecommunications grids. They are locking absolutely everything down under martial control. And what is severely complicating this whole transition is the looming succession crisis. The current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is quite aging. He's reported to be frail and in poor health. And crucially, there is no clearly designated successor ready to take his place.
So you essentially have a massive power vacuum developing at the very top,
hmm
a ruthless military takeover happening in the middle management layer, and a historic civilian massacre happening at the bottom on the streets.
It is the ultimate recipe for absolute catastrophic state disaster.
Let us move into Section 3 of our deep dive here, the economics of collapse.
Yeah.
Because debating high politics and structural theory is one thing. We can sit here and talk about IRGC generals and the supreme leader's succession all day long, but historically, regimes do not usually fall because of abstract philosophical disagreements. They fall because regular working people cannot afford to eat.
It all comes down to the biological imperative. A government can violently suppress political ideas, they can ban books and shut down the internet, but you cannot suppress human hunger. You cannot suppress a dying patient's need for insulin. Biology always wins out over ideology.
And the economic statistics cited in this report are incredibly grim. Official inflation is hovering around 60%, which means real inflation is probably much higher. Basic infrastructure is completely failing. There are rolling power outages that are totally crippling civilian communications. But the one statistic that really stopped me dead in my tracks, the one that made me put the paper down and just stare at the wall for a second, was the pharmacy statistic.
Yes. The report clearly states that 80% of pharmacies face imminent bankruptcy.
80%. 8 out of 10 pharmacies in the entire country.
This is where we need to move the conversation from the macroeconomic spreadsheet down to the local storefront. Because systemic revolutions aren't always started by charismatic leaders writing political manifestos. Sometimes the revolution starts simply because a normal person cannot buy a bottle of aspirin to save their life.
Walk me through what that actually looks like on a Tuesday afternoon in Tehran.
Okay, let us peel back the clinical layer of a word like bankruptcy. Imagine you are a regular working father in Tehran right now in February 2026. Your young child gets sick with a standard bacterial infection. Nothing exotic, just a basic infection. Back in, say, 2020, you walk 3 blocks down the street, you hand over a few bills, you buy some basic amoxicillin, and you are back home giving it to your kid in 10 minutes.
Right. A totally simple, mundane errand.
But in February 2026, you walk to that first neighborhood pharmacy, the metal grate is pulled down, it's shuttered, bankrupt. So you panic a little, and you jog to the second pharmacy a mile away. The door is open, but you look inside, and the shelves are completely bare. They have nothing. Finally, you take a cab across town and find a third pharmacy that actually has the antibiotic in stock. But the pharmacist looks at you with pity and tells you that the price has literally tripled since yesterday afternoon because the national currency, the rial, just completely collapsed against the US dollar that morning.
And you physically just do not have that amount of cash in your wallet.
Exactly. Or even worse, the pharmacist tells you he can't even buy new stock from his medical supplier because the international supplier refuses to take the deeply devalued local currency anymore. So now put yourself in that father's shoes. You have a sick, feverish child at home, and you are staring at a government apparatus that is spending billions upon billions of dollars burying advanced nuclear centrifuges deep inside mountains. But they cannot manage to put a simple $5 bottle of generic antibiotics on a pharmacy shelf for your kid.
That is exactly the friction point where the grand political narrative becomes intensely, violently personal.
That is exactly where the survival trap kicks in. The expert analysis in the source material talks extensively about this concept, the survival trap. It is the ultimate, inescapable catch-22 for a tyrannical regime.
Explain the mechanics of this trap for us.
Well, the regime desperately needs to fix the domestic economy to stop the food riots and the protests. To fix the economy, they absolutely have to get the crushing international financial sanctions lifted. But to get those sanctions lifted, they have to engage diplomatically with the West, specifically the United States, and they have to make major verifiable concessions regarding their nuclear enrichment program and their funding of regional proxy militias.
Okay, looking at it rationally, that seems like a logical trade-off.
Yeah.
Just make the diplomatic deal, fix your broken economy, feed your people, and you get to stay in power.
Right, but you are thinking rationally. For a deeply hardline, revolutionary ideological regime, Actively engaging with the West and compromising on their core military tenets is viewed internally as outright heresy. It is viewed as an unforgivable weakness. If they open up to the West, they fundamentally lose their revolutionary ideological soul. But if they absolutely refuse to open up, they lose their economic body and the state starves to death. They are totally trapped in a downward death spiral entirely of their own making.
So they cannot go back to the way things were, but they refuse to go forward.
And so they do the only thing a rigid system knows how to do. They dig in deeper. They choose absolute fortification, which perfectly brings us to the massive geopolitical powder keg we are sitting on top of right now.
Section 4. This is the ticking clock portion of the deep dive, because while the neighborhood pharmacies are closing their doors permanently, the subterranean nuclear labs are apparently running double shifts. We have a highly alarming report here from Sky News Australia, and it specifically references a dire warning from an official named Witkoff.
Yes, and the headline of that report is objectively terrifying. It states that Iran is quite literally a week away from having the necessary nuclear bomb-making material.
A week. 7 days. We have been doing this show for a while, and usually when we talk about nuclear proliferation, we hear timelines measured in months, or usually years.
We have discussed the concept of nuclear breakout time on this show for years. Breakout time is the window required to enrich enough material if they decide to sprint for a bomb. But saying they are a week away changes the entire geopolitical calculus overnight. It means the diplomatic window for a negotiated settlement isn't just gradually closing, it is essentially painted shut and nailed to the frame.
I really want to clarify something highly specific for the listener here so we don't cause unnecessary panic. When the report says bomb-making material, does that explicitly mean they have a fully constructed, viable nuclear weapon ready to drop from a plane?
No, not necessarily. We need to be precise here. It means they have successfully enriched a sufficient quantity of uranium gas, up to 90% purity, which is considered weapons grade, to form the fissile core of a single nuclear warhead. They still have to jump through massive technical hurdles. They have to miniaturize that material into a deliverable warhead. They have to successfully mount it onto the nosecone of a ballistic missile. And ideally, they need to conduct a successful underground test to ensure the detonation sequence actually works. So they don't have a bomb on a launch pad today. But, and this is the crucial part, once you have secured the highly enriched material, the truly difficult part of the physics is done. You can easily hide a small sphere of weapons-grade uranium in a random basement anywhere in the country. You cannot easily bomb it out of existence once it is refined and dispersed. So hitting that 1-week metric is effectively crossing the point of no return.
And sitting squarely on the other side of that equation, we have the current stance of the United States. We have President Trump back in office in this timeline. And the source reports a highly specific 10-day deadline being issued.
The ultimatum: stop the high-level uranium enrichment immediately, drastically limit the range of your ballistic missiles, or face the severe consequences. And we are currently seeing corroborated reports of a massive, unprecedented U.S. military, naval, and air buildup occurring in the Persian Gulf right now as we speak.
It is not just the U.S. posturing, though. There is this absolutely fascinating and frankly deeply unnerving detail pulled from a report by HT India. The headline reads, "Tehran on edge. India tells citizens, get out by any means."
That is a massive blinking red indicator. I pay very close attention to consular and diplomatic travel warnings for leaving. Usually, foreign ministries speak in very guarded bureaucratic code. They will issue a statement saying citizens should exercise elevated caution, or they advise citizens to avoid non-essential tourist travel to a region.
Right, the usual keep your head down and stay away from large crowds kind of advice.
Exactly. But when a major, deeply influential neutral power like India, a country which historically has maintained very decent pragmatic diplomatic and trade relations with Iran, they are a major buyer of Iranian oil. When the Indian government explicitly tells its own citizens to leave the country by any means necessary, that is the international diplomatic equivalent of pulling the fire alarm in a crowded theater.
It essentially means their intelligence services know for a fact that something catastrophic is about to happen.
It means they fully expect the commercial airspace over Iran to be closed by military decree any day now. They expect the international airports in Tehran to be actively bombed. They're essentially telling their people, grab a backpack and literally walk to the border of a neighboring country if you have to, but get out of the blast radius right now.
And yet, amidst all this incredibly dire warning, the Iranian leadership seems, almost weirdly defiant, detached from reality. The force analysis actually uses a specific term for it: strategic vertigo.
It is an absolutely brilliant descriptive term, strategic vertigo. Think about when you are a little kid and you spin around in circles on the lawn as fast as you can, and then you suddenly stop and try to walk in a straight line. You stumble entirely. You genuinely think you are walking straight. Your brain is telling you that you're upright, but you immediately crash sideways into the wall. The hardline Iranian regime is currently suffering from acute strategic vertigo.
How so exactly? Break down that vertigo for us.
They are completely fundamentally misjudging their own systemic vulnerability. Look at the wider regional context provided in the source documentation. Their entire network of regional proxies is severely degraded. Hezbollah in Lebanon is struggling massively. Bashar al-Assad, their key ally, has already fallen in Syria. They are more diplomatically and militarily isolated than they have been in decades. Yet, despite all of this, they are intentionally dragging their feet in these backdoor diplomatic talks being mediated by Oman. They are acting as if they hold all the cards and have all the time in the world to negotiate. They legitimately do not realize that the patience of the international community, and specifically the patience of a Trump administration that has literally issued a public 10-day deadline, has entirely run out.
So they're sitting there intensely pondering their next move in a game of chess, completely oblivious to the fact that the other player has already flipped the table over.
Exactly. And just to add to the regional nightmare, the source briefly touches on the chaos expanding eastward, mentioning that authorities in Afghanistan are publicly promising severe military responses to recent cross-border airstrikes conducted by Pakistan. The entire geopolitical region from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas is a massive, soaked tinderbox waiting for a single spark.
Which naturally brings us to Section 5 of our outline, the overall atmosphere. We've spent the last half hour talking about hard facts, economic stats, geopolitical deadlines, and military posturing. But what does it actually feel like to be alive in this moment? Because if you are a normal person living through this specific week, it doesn't feel like a sterile political science lecture. It feels deeply apocalyptic. The source packet actually includes some really fascinating video commentary from Rabbi David Pinto.
I thought this was a really uniquely compelling inclusion in the source stack because it steps away from the military strategy and gives us the raw spiritual pulse of the current moment.
Just looking at the titles of his videos sets the mood. We have one titled, "The War is Approaching and the World Keeps Sleeping," and another titled, "Wars, Confusion, Darkness, a Sign that Mashiach is at the Door."
Now, whether you, the listener, are a deeply religious person or a complete atheist, you really have to look at this kind of commentary anthropologically. When do regular, everyday people start earnestly talking about the end times? When do religious scholars start loudly proclaiming that the Messiah, or the Mashiach, is literally standing at the door, ready to return?
When things feel completely, overwhelmingly hopeless. When the rational, predictable rules of the modern world just stop making any sense.
Right. When your daily reality consists of state-sponsored massacres of 30,000 people, systemic plagues like the total collapse of the medical supply chain and pharmacy bankruptcies, and the very real imminent threat of regional nuclear war. Rabbi Pinto's passionate commentary reflects a very real, very raw psychological reality right now. Large groups of people genuinely feel like they're living through the violent end of a historical era. The overwhelming darkness that he speaks of in his sermons isn't just a poetic religious metaphor. It is quite literally the rolling electrical blackouts in downtown Tehran. It is the thick, acrid smoke from burning car tires blocking the highways.
There's also this really interesting sidebar context included in the brief. The author of the main blog post we are analyzing, Paramendra Kumar Bhagat, who goes by Barack Face. Amidst all this heavy political analysis, he has a blog post titled, "The Great Cosmic Prank. Why Allah Might Just Be." It suggests this profound, radical rethinking of the universe that happens when societies break down.
Extreme crisis breeds extreme radicalism, sure, but it also breeds incredibly deep, agonizing introspection. When the world is ending around you, people start questioning the very foundational nature of their reality. You start hearing questions like, why is this horrific suffering happening to us? Is this some kind of divine punishment for our sins? Is this a cosmic test of our faith?
And when you zoom out and look at the wider global picture this week, it is not just the Middle East that is completely chaotic. The source brief mentions several totally unrelated headlines just to set the mood of the week. We've got a massive weather event, a bomb cyclone violently slamming into 40 million Americans. The New York Post headline is "Blizzard Blasts Northeast."
It perfectly adds to the overall texture of global chaos. Think about the psychological load on a person right now. If you are just a regular news junkie scrolling on your phone in February 2026, you open your daily feed and you are hit with imminent nuclear war in the Persian Gulf, a historic, paralyzing weather disaster wiping out the power grid in New York, and the total violent collapse of the government in Syria. It creates this overwhelming, inescapable sense of global, systemic instability.
And then, just to make the timeline feel even weirder and more surreal, there's a totally random report from Beyond News about how NASA recorded the ambient sound of the sun, and scientists realize it creates a frequency perfectly identical to the chanting of the Hindu syllable Om.
It's just a little piece of cosmic curiosity amidst the absolute doom and gloom, but it oddly fits the overarching theme, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When the human systems of politics and economics are failing so spectacularly, people naturally start looking upwards for connection. They start searching the stars for a deeper meaning, for something vast and ancient that is bigger than the miserable political mess we are currently trapped in.
It creates a wildly chaotic information environment. The learner, the person listening to us right now, is trying to navigate through all of this static and noise.
And that is exactly why the concept of strategic vertigo applies to absolutely everyone right now, not just the isolated Iranian regime. It is incredibly hard to maintain your intellectual and emotional balance when the very ground beneath your feet feels like it is constantly violently shaking.
So let us take a breath and try to find some analytical balance here. Let us look toward the future. Section 6 of our outline. Scenarios. Where exactly does all of this go from here? How does the glass giant actually shatter?
Well, we return to the core choice, fracture versus fortification. As we have seen, the regime has definitively chosen the path of fortification. They are physically hardening their underground nuclear sites with concrete and steel. They are brutally locking down the civilian population with military force.
And as we learned earlier from Marcel Dircis's theory, attempting forced fortification usually just dramatically accelerates the final fracture.
Correct. The tighter you squeeze your fist around the glass pillar, the faster the pressure builds and the faster it violently shatters in your hand.
There is a specific video title referenced in the source material that caught my eye: Why Decapitation Strikes Could Topple Iran. That is a very highly specific, incredibly aggressive military phrase to use. Decapitation strike.
It is a severe term.
Yeah.
And it speaks directly to the deeply flawed internal structure of the regime itself. Remember the whole premise we started with. It is a glass giant. In a flexible, resilient Western democracy, if the president tragically dies in office, there is an established vice president ready to step in. If the vice president is gone, there is the Speaker of the House. There is a deep, historically respected chain of command. The system is fundamentally designed to absorb massive shocks and keep functioning.
But in a rigid, brittle tyranny like the one we were discussing,
In a brittle system, there is no institutional resilience. If you launch a precision strike and remove the absolute top layer, say the supreme leader, and the top dozen IRGC commanding generals are wiped out in a single night cleat. The prevailing military theory is that the entire state apparatus instantly crumbles into dust. There is no real horizontal loyalty among the lower ranks. There is no shared dedication to the Constitution. There is only strict vertical loyalty built entirely on fear, directed at the one guy sitting at the very top. If the guy at the top is suddenly vaporized,
the entire structural integrity of the pyramid collapses inward. It is literally like pulling the singular keystone out of a stone archway. Everything falls.
everything falls. But, and this is the absolutely massive, terrifying puzzle bet that policymakers lose sleep over what exactly replaces that massive structure when it falls.
The source material issues a very stark warning here. It mentions that state failure might replace traditional regime change.
That is the ultimate danger of total chaos. In the West, we often harbor this highly romanticized, almost cinematic idea of how a revolution works. The evil dictator falls from power, the oppressed people flood the streets cheering and crying, they pull the giant bronze statues down with ropes, and then suddenly beautiful democratic institutions just magically bloom from the rubble the next morning.
Right. Everybody pictures the joyous scenes of the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989.
Exactly. We use 1989 as the universal template. But the geopolitical analysis warns that in the reality of Iran in 2026, with the domestic economy totally, utterly destroyed, civil institutions completely hollowed out by corruption, and heavily armed military factions running everything, the fall of the central regime might not look anything like Berlin in 1989. It might look exactly like Libya after Gaddafi fell. It might look like Somalia in the 1990s.
You were talking about total, catastrophic anarchy, warlords dividing up neighborhoods,
Power vacuums are the most historically dangerous things on Earth. If the central governing authority simply vanishes overnight because of a decapitation strike, who physically runs the electrical power plants the next day? Who actively guards the international borders? Who enforces the law and stops the revenge killings? If you have 30,000 angry, grieving families who just had their loved ones slaughtered by the state security forces, what exactly do you think happens the morning those security forces no longer have the protection of the state?
Unimaginable bloody revenge.
Generational blood feuds playing out in the streets with military-grade weapons. That is an incredibly sobering thought to contend with. We absolutely want the brutal tyranny to end, yes, but the specific manner of its ending matters immensely to the millions of innocent people caught in the crossfire.
It really does. And our job, conducting an impartial observation of the facts, demands that we fully acknowledge that horrific risk. The sudden fall of a tyrant is undeniably a moment of incredible hope and liberation, yes. But it is simultaneously a moment of extreme, volatile danger.
It is walking a total tightrope over a volcano.
So let us try to bring this incredibly heavy deep dive home. We have traveled a long way today. We went from the abstract theoretical concept of brittleness and the glass giant, through the unspeakable horrors of the 30,000 dead in the January massacre, through the crushing daily economic despair of the 80% pharmacy bankruptcies, all the way to the ticking geopolitical clock of a one-week nuclear breakout and a 10-day presidential ultimatum.
It is a profoundly tragic historical trajectory to witness.
The core tragedy for me, sitting here looking at all these sources scattered across the desk, is the immense human cost. The regime's absolute stubborn refusal to bend is mathematically guaranteeing its eventual break. We know that for a fact. History tells us that unequivocally. Marcel Diers's research proves that. But in the interim, in that agonizing, protracted space of time between their stubborn refusal to adapt and the final violent break of the system, millions of real, everyday people are paying the ultimate price.
30,000 dead in a single weekend. Millions of parents unable to find basic antibiotics for their children. The total destruction of a society's potential. That is the true, measurable cost of systemic brittleness.
So as we wrap up, what does all of this mean for the listener? Why should the person listening to this right now care deeply about the internal structural dynamics of the Iranian government in February 2026, aside from the obvious, terrifying threat of global nuclear war?
Because the core concept of brittleness is an entirely universal lesson. It transcends Middle Eastern geopolitics. It directly applies to massive corporate monopolies that absolutely refuse to innovate and get wiped out by startups. It applies to rigid family dynamics where parents refuse to discuss hard, painful truths with their children until the family fractures permanently. It applies to literally any human system. Supreme inflexibility is a guaranteed death sentence in a rapidly changing world. If you cannot or will not adapt to reality will eventually break you. Iran right now is just the absolute most dramatic, highest stakes example of that universal law of physics playing out in real time on the world stage.
That is an incredibly powerful takeaway to keep in mind. We essentially have to remain flexible just to survive the modern world.
We have to be exactly like the bamboo that bends in the wind, not the rigid oak tree that snaps in half during the storm.
I want to leave everyone listening with one final, deeply provocative thought to chew on as they go about the rest of their day. Earlier, we talked extensively about the concept of strategic vertigo and how the dying regime is desperately building a heavily armed fortress to survive.
Yes, the fortress mentality.
If a paranoid regime spends all its time and resources building a massive, impenetrable fortress to keep the terrifying outside world out, at what exact point does that supposed fortress inevitably become a locked prison for the innocent people trapped inside? And far more importantly, when those massive concrete walls finally do begin to crack, and history guarantees us that they absolutely will crack, do those heavy walls fall outward onto their perceived enemies? Or do they fall violently inward, completely crushing the very citizens they were originally built to protect?
That right there is the defining, terrifying question of 2026.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly intense journey today. Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive. Stay curious, stay flexible, and we will catch you next time.
Take care, everyone.